We had a problem with Ontario and the electricity. You shouldn't be playing with electricity. It affects people's lives.
Our old relationship with the United States is over.
A stunning announcement from Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney has just rocked one of North America's most reliable partnerships. For the first time in decades, Ottawa has suspended all new electricity export licenses to the United States and is even weighing the cancellation of long-term contracts. These deals have long powered millions of U.S. homes and businesses with cheap, clean Canadian energy. Since the 1960s, this cross-border flow of hydroelectricity has been the backbone of regional stability, keeping lights on and prices low from New York to Minnesota. But now, that foundation is suddenly at risk. Experts warn this could mark the end of a 6-decade energy alliance and the start of a new flashpoint between the U.S. and Canada. From strategic cooperation to tense confrontation, the energy relationship between Canada and the United States was once considered one of the most successful and stable models of cross-border cooperation in the world since the 1960s. The two nations have signed a series of long-term agreements on the supply and distribution of electricity, built on Canada's overwhelming advantages in hydroelectric power and renewable energy. Provinces such as Quebec, Manitoba, and British Columbia, endowed with massive hydroelectric dams and abundant water resources, have become the natural power plants of North America. From there, gigawatts of electricity are transmitted via ultra-high voltage cross-border lines to supply northern U.S. states, particularly New York, Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine, Minnesota, North Dakota, Montana, and Washington. These contracts have brought clear bilateral benefits. For the United States, they ensured a stable supply of electricity at lower prices than many domestic sources, eased the burden on the grid during peak seasons, and prevented large-scale blackouts. For Canada, they generated massive foreign currency revenue estimated at between 4 and 5 billion USD annually, while reinforcing its position as America's most reliable energy partner. For decades, this relationship was virtually immune to political turbulence. Even when the two countries clashed over trade in softwood, lumber, agricultural products, or steel and aluminum, electricity agreements remained a safe zone in bilateral cooperation. However, this picture began to crack in early 2025. Under pressure to protect domestic industries, the U.S. government imposed additional tariffs and technical barriers on a wide range of Canadian exports, from lumber and grains to certain processed goods. Ottawa viewed this as a violation of the spirit of the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement. Initially, Canada's retaliation was limited to counter-tariffs in agriculture and processed goods sectors. But when negotiations stalled, Prime Minister Mark Carney's government decided to play its trump card: electricity. This marked the first time in modern history that Canada has deliberately tightened electricity exports to the United States as a tool of political and trade pressure. This move instantly transformed a relationship built on strategic trust and mutual dependence into a potential front for confrontation with the risk of escalation. Experts call this a dangerous turning point because once energy becomes weaponized, it is no longer merely a matter of trade, but a geopolitical lever capable of destabilizing the entire North American region. Canada's sudden suspension of electricity exports sent an immediate jolt through the U.S. grid. In 2024, the U.S. imported 60 to 70 terawatt-hours of Canadian power, just 2% nationally, but a lifeline for northern states. Vermont depends on Canada for over half its electricity, Maine for 40%, and New York for up to a quarter during peak seasons. Minnesota and North Dakota also rely heavily, especially in the winter. Within days, the loss created a dangerous supply gap. Utilities scrambled to rebalance the grid, ramping up natural gas and even coal plants, despite higher costs and environmental backlash. Wind and solar couldn't fill the void fast enough. Wholesale prices in New England and New York spiked by 15 to 30% in just 72 hours. and some regions faced the threat of rolling blackouts. The U.S. government scrambled to respond. Regulators held emergency meetings, states launched power-saving programs, and coal and gas plants were ordered to run at full tilt. The White House even weighed boosting imports from Mexico. But the crisis exposed a bigger truth. America's grid, the largest in the world, still leans dangerously on Canada. One political shock in Ottawa was enough to threaten the stability of the entire U.S. power system. Beyond the technical issues, the tightening of Canadian electricity exports has immediate and serious consequences for the U.S. economy and society. At the household level, electricity bills in states such as Vermont, Maine, and New York could rise by 15 to 25% within just a few weeks if the situation continues. For many low-income families already struggling with inflation, this is an additional burden. For industries, particularly electricity-intensive sectors such as aluminum, steel, data centers, and manufacturing, higher energy costs mean rising production costs, threatening competitiveness, and potentially forcing them to cut jobs. Companies operating in energy-sensitive regions, such as Vermont's aluminum smelters or New York's semiconductor plants, are among the most vulnerable. In agriculture, although not a direct electricity consumer, the higher energy costs for irrigation, refrigeration, and food processing will indirectly increase costs for farmers and consumers. Grocery prices may rise, further fueling inflation. This situation also creates political and social pressure. Governors of states heavily dependent on Canadian electricity are facing public anger. In New York, politicians warn of risks to grid reliability and affordability, urging the federal government to act quickly to resolve tensions with Canada. In Vermont and Maine, protests have already broken out, demanding Washington prioritize protecting local energy security. Why did Prime Minister Mark Carney decide to take such a drastic step when both sides had previously avoided touching electricity? Analysts believe there are three main reasons. First, electricity is Canada's trump card. While Ottawa exports many products to the U.S., such as lumber, agricultural goods, and raw materials, only electricity is truly irreplaceable in the short term. Unlike oil or natural gas, which can be substituted on the global market, electricity depends on the availability of direct cross-border transmission lines. If Canada reduces supply, the U.S. cannot quickly replace it with another source. Second, Ottawa wants to send a strong political message. By suspending new export licenses and threatening long-term contracts, Canada wants Washington to realize that trade disputes cannot remain one-sided. Canada is not merely a junior partner, but can use its energy advantages to protect its national interests. Third, this move is also aimed at strengthening Carney's domestic position. Facing opposition criticism of being too soft on the U.S., the Prime Minister chose to take a hard line, demonstrating Canada's readiness to defend its economic sovereignty, even if it means risking confrontation with its closest ally. This, however, is a double-edged sword. While it may bring short-term political and negotiation advantages, in the long term it could undermine Canada's reputation as a reliable energy partner and push the U.S. to invest more aggressively in alternative energy, reducing dependence on Canadian supply. The Trump administration is facing a serious dilemma. On one hand, it cannot allow Canada to use electricity as a tool of political and trade pressure, because that would set a precedent, weakening U.S. strategic credibility. On the other hand, retaliating too harshly could escalate tensions and directly harm millions of American households and businesses. The White House's immediate options are limited. Washington can pursue diplomatic channels, urging Ottawa to resume electricity exports under existing agreements. It can also use mechanisms under the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement to sue Canada for violating commitments. However, such processes take months, if not years, while the electricity crisis requires immediate solutions. Economic retaliation is also on the table, such as increasing tariffs on Canadian exports or suspending other cooperation projects. But these measures could prompt Ottawa to respond even more fiercely, creating a spiral of escalation. Some voices in Washington are urging long-term solutions. This includes accelerating investment in domestic renewable energy, expanding transmission lines to increase flexibility, and even considering importing more electricity from Mexico. However, all these plans require years to materialize and cannot solve the immediate crisis. In the short term, the U.S. is forced to accept higher costs and grid instability while negotiating with Canada. This dilemma reflects a broader vulnerability. Even as a global superpower, the United States is not immune to the consequences of energy interdependence with its neighbors. This crisis carries a far greater danger than past trade disputes. It threatens to spiral into an energy war. Electricity isn't just another commodity. It powers homes, industries, and national security. If Canada keeps tightening supply, Washington may retaliate in finance, defense, or infrastructure, triggering Ottawa to restrict not only electricity, but also oil, gas, and uranium. Such moves could disrupt hundreds of billions in trade and shake the entire North American economy. Worse, a breakdown in trust could weaken NATO cooperation, Arctic defense, and intelligence sharing. The danger here is clear. What begins as an energy dispute could escalate into a full-blown strategic confrontation. The Canada-US electricity standoff does not occur in isolation. Its ripple effects are already being felt globally. For one, energy markets are closely interconnected. As the U.S. scrambles to replace Canadian electricity with alternative sources, demand for natural gas, coal, and renewables within the United States could surge. This would drive up global prices, affecting countries in Europe and Asia that also depend on imported energy. In addition, the crisis undermines North America's reputation as a stable economic bloc. Investors who once saw the US and Canada as reliable partners may now view them as unpredictable. This could divert investment toward other regions, weakening both economies in the long term. Geopolitically, rivals such as China and Russia are watching closely. They see in this crisis an opportunity to highlight the fragility of Western alliances. Russia, for example, could use this moment to strengthen its narrative that energy interdependence always leads to vulnerability, something it has repeatedly exploited in Europe. Meanwhile, China may seek to expand its influence in North America's energy market, perhaps by offering financing or technology for renewable projects in both the US and Canada. Such a development could alter the strategic balance, drawing America's closest neighbor into deeper cooperation with Beijing at Washington's expense. The future of US-Canada electricity cooperation now hangs in the balance. Will leaders find common ground, or is this the start of a lasting rupture? The answer depends on whether politics or pragmatism wins out. A return to compromise could save the six-decade energy partnership, perhaps with Washington easing protectionist measures and Ottawa reopening its export channels. But if pride and domestic pressure dominate, the U.S. will push harder to diversify, pouring money into renewables and cutting reliance on Canadian power. Canada, meanwhile, could pivot toward new markets, even exploring ambitious undersea links to Europe. For ordinary citizens, the stakes are personal: higher electricity bills, job risks, and rising living costs. This crisis is no longer just a geopolitical standoff. It's a question of everyday survival for millions on both sides of the border. This isn't surface-level news. This is what's shaping the next decade. If you're someone who thinks deeper, welcome to the front row. Subscribe to Globe Chaos Insights.